Alright troops, Koala here. Fighters, fighter planes, fighter jets, light fighters, heavy fighters, multi-role stealth fighters, whatever needs fighting, and however you need to do it, they've been doing it for over 100 years. During that time, the technologies and tactics used by fighter pilots have come a long way, from the Red Baron diving out of the sun on unsuspecting allied triplanes, to Mach 2 jet fighters downing each other with beyond visual range missiles. Each era has brought about new capabilities and new ways to use them. In the past, we've talked about the jet fighter era and what separates the different generations from each other. But today, we're going a wee bit deeper down. Welcome back to the Armorcast channel, where in today's video, I'm actually handing over to a good friend of mine, PilotPhotog, or just Tog as I know him, to walk us through the evolution of fighter tactics.
Hi everyone, PilotPhotog here. Like any form of combat, air-to-air dogfighting has been a series of advancements and counters which have kept the game of cat and mouse going for over 100 years. At the dawn of the 20th century, the newly invented airplane was thrust into World War I. Initially being used as a forward reconnaissance vehicle, it didn't take long for pilots to arm themselves, first with pistols and rifles, and then with machine guns mounted to the airframes. Opposing aircraft would maneuver to get behind the opponent and bring their guns to bear. The art and science of dogfighting had been born. One of the most effective ways of getting on an enemy's tail involved attacking from the sun, which made it difficult for the defenders to react in time. Perhaps the group that used this to best effect was Germany's WWI, famously known as the Flying Circus and led by Manfred von Richthofen, aka the Red Baron. The Red Baron would tally 80 kills in his brief career. By the time World War II broke out, airplanes had begun using monowing designs consisting of mostly metal skins. As a result, range and altitude had doubled and top speeds had tripled. Echoing tactics from the First World War, German Me-109s made effective use of attacking from the sun, surprising their opponents to great effect. The Germans were also early adopters of the Finger 4 or Vic formation, which consisted of two pairs of fighters. Each pair was composed of a lead plane and a wingman, with the wingman's responsibility being to cover the lead as he engaged targets. This tactic is still in use today. As the war progressed, strategic bombing became more important, as well as methods to counter the bombers. Heavy long-range four-engine bombers were sent from England to the heart of Germany to pound its industrial centers. Initially, there were no fighters with the range to escort the bombers all the way to their targets and back, and losses mounted. After obtaining lessons learned from the Battle of Britain and an infamous 100-day paper-to-prototype session, the North American P-51 Mustang was born. The Mustang was fast, maneuverable, well-armed, and had the range to escort the bombers to their targets and back, helping turn the tide of the war. World War II was also the proving ground for carrier aviation, with naval battles such as Midway involving enemy fleets of ships which did not fire upon each other. Instead, carrier air wings traded blows and sunk ships. The Corsair and Hellcat proved to be war-winning designs that dominated the skies in the Pacific. The Korean War saw the introduction and wide use of jet fighters. Speeds have become even faster, making engagements more deadly, along with allowing for rapid closure into combat and escapes out of combat. The machine gun was still the primary weapon, and F-86 Sabres dueled with MiG-15s in a contested airspace which became known as MiG Alley. Still, during the Korean War, the weapons used to engage enemy fighters were essentially the same as the ones used in World Wars I and II, the machine gun and the cannon. Following the Korean War, a new weapon would be introduced that would forever change air-to-air combat. The guided air-to-air missile could defeat targets at ranges far exceeding machine guns or cannons, and flew at faster speeds than any fighter aircraft. This made the case for a game-changing weapon. Missiles can generally be classified into two categories, the first being beyond visual range or BVR, which typically consists of radar-guided medium to long-range missiles like the AIM-7 Sparrow or the AIM-54 Phoenix. And the second category being within visual range or WVR, which typically consists of heat-seeking missiles like the AIM-9 Sidewinder. Early proponents of what became known as the missile theory felt that radar-guided beyond visual range missiles would be the future of air combat, and that the machine gun was a weapon of the past. As a result, new fighters came into service which had no internal guns, most famously in the F-4 Phantom. The Vietnam War was the first large-scale war in which missiles would be put to the test. The BVR AIM-7 Sparrow was a radar-homing missile, meaning that the aircraft firing the missile had to keep its nose pointed to the target until the missile hit. This made the firing aircraft somewhat vulnerable as it could not perform evasive maneuvers after launching the Sparrow. On top of this, the humid and tropical Vietnam environment caused the electronics in many Sparrows to fail. The problem became so bad that pilots would ripple fire multiple Sparrows at a single enemy aircraft in the hopes of one making it all the way to the target. Additionally, the complex and politically driven rules of engagement, or ROE, forbade American pilots from engaging a target until it was visually identified, further reducing any advantage a BVR missile like the Sparrow may have had. The North Vietnamese took advantage of the restrictive ROE and used their modern for the time MiG-21s to great effect as an ambush interceptor. Ground controllers would wait until the American fighter bombers were approaching and then launch their MiG-21s to attack the bomb-laden F-105s with great success. Then Colonel Robin Olds led a reverse ambush raid on the MiG-21s by disguising his F-4s as F-105s and shooting down the MiG-21s as they arrived. The combination of faulty missiles and restrictive ROE ultimately caused pilots to revert to close-in dogfighting, with both short-range Sidewinders and guns. The use of guns during this period is perhaps most famously embodied by the F-8 Crusader, which, although armed with AIM-9 Sidewinders as its main armament, made effective use of its 4 20mm cannons and became known as the last gunfighter. F-8s accounted for 14 MiG-17 kills and 4 MiG-21s during the Vietnam War.
Whoa there, Tog. Let's not confuse people. Just to break in quickly here to clarify, the F-8 Crusader is one of the most interesting proponents of this changing doctrine, and while it is famously known as the last of the gunfighters, that's a nickname that isn't all that accurate. Let me explain. In fact, as we mentioned briefly in a recent video, the Crusader was designed for the exact same role the F-4 Phantom was, which was primarily GCI or Ground Control Intercept mission. As a lighter, single-engine aircraft, however, the Crusader could operate off of smaller carriers like the Essex class, while the bigger, heavier F-4s could not. While F-8 pilots were trained more in close combat maneuvering than the F-4 crews were, at least initially, the main reason for such training was to allow pilots to line up those perfect missile shots with the AIM-9 Sidewinder and give them the best chance of a kill, not to go in with guns. Vietnam-era Sidewinders were only able to lock onto targets from the rear aspect where they could see, quote-unquote, the target's engine exhaust, and they also couldn't pull tight turns without losing a lock, so pilots had to be in the right positions at the right times to actually guarantee a kill. The F-8 as an airframe itself actually wasn't especially good at dogfighting compared to the Phantoms, and in fact the two jets would face off frequently in training dogfights where the Phantoms would win. A lot. The guns of the Crusader were already seen as a last resort weapon for a fighter and accounted for only 12% of the Crusader's kills. It was this need though for missile combat to still rely on knowledge of close-in maneuvering and BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, that sparked the creation of training programs like the US Air Force's Red Flag or the Navy's famous Top Gun. An aircraft like Northrop's F-5 were and still are used today as so-called aggressor aircraft, role-playing enemy fighters and putting Eagle or Hornet pilots through their paces.
To further counter the growing missile threat, aircraft began to carry anti-missile countermeasures. Flares were used to thwart heat-seeking missiles, and chaff were used to counter radar-guided missiles. Additionally, as the Vietnam War was in full swing, a program to develop a single fighter for both the Navy and the Air Force was underway. The Tactical Fighter Experimental, or TFX, ultimately culminated in the F-111. While the F-111 would prove to be a capable and fast, low-attack aircraft, its lack of maneuverability made it less than ideal as a fighter. Additionally, the F-111 was too big and heavy to operate out of carriers, meaning that its mission to both serve as a Navy and Air Force fighter was not realized. Ultimately, the F-111 would embody all that was wrong with the missile theory, sacrificing maneuverability for speed. The lessons learned from the Vietnam War directly led to the teen series of fighters, the F-14, F-15, F-16, and F-18, all of which included an internal gun and incorporated maneuverability. The F-14 and F-15 were designed as long-range fighters which had higher top speeds, while the F-16 and F-18 were more maneuverable and less expensive to operate. The teen series were introduced in the 1970s and with the exception of the Tomcat are still in service today. During this time, missile technology and reliability greatly improved. The AIM-120 AMRAAM provided fire-and-forget BVR capability, meaning that once the launching aircraft obtained a target lock and fired the missile, it was free to perform evasive maneuvers or engage another target as the AMRAAM was self-guided. The Gulf War in 1991 was the first large-scale use of stealth aircraft, which incorporated design features that would significantly reduce an aircraft's radar cross-section or RCS. The F-117 Nighthawk led the initial strikes into Iraq, destroying radar and SAM sites to make way for the larger groups of coalition fighters. As a result of the Gulf War, the US decided to implement an all-stealth fighter fleet. The F-22 was to be the replacement of the Air Force's F-15 air superiority fighter, while the F-35 was to replace the Air Force's multi-role F-16 and Navy's F-18. The F-35 or Joint Strike Fighter is an air-to-everything platform, performing the same roles that the Hornet is tasked with today. Interestingly, one of the reasons the F-14 was phased out in favor of the F-18 Super Hornet was that the F-18 could perform many roles, including air-to-air, air-to-ground, and even refueling tanker. The F-35 took the multi-role concept even further, creating a version that each branch could use: the A model for the Air Force, the B model for the Marines, and the C model for the Navy. Russia, meanwhile, has focused on thrust vectoring and super maneuverability. The Su-27 series of fighters, which include the Su-30 and Su-33, feature three-dimensional thrust vectoring and were designed to be super maneuverable. This doctrine favoring super maneuverability comes at the cost of stealth, which was a design decision Russia has made. However, stealth apparently does matter, as Russia recently has been working on the Su-57 and the newly announced Checkmate. The next 10 years should be telling as to which direction fighter planes and missiles take in terms of new developments. Thanks for watching, and thank you, ArmorCast, for having me on as a guest.
Thanks, Tog, and I hope you lads have enjoyed this video. That's going to be about it for today. There are, of course, many different tangents we could have gone off on here, such as the use of VTOL fighters like the famous Harrier jump jet, which were instrumental in Britain's recapture of the Falkland Islands and perfectly suited to the US Marine Corps' needs. Or there's Russia's use of not just highly maneuverable short-range fighters like the MiG-29 or Su-27, but the exact opposite too, in huge interceptors like the MiG-25 and MiG-31. Interestingly, Israel actually asked for the radars in their French-built Mirage fighters to be removed entirely to allow for more fuel storage, as the radars would like to overheat anyway in the Middle Eastern climate, and they just weren't considered worth the trade-off for the role Israel was using its fighters for. We haven't talked too much about ground attack, because that is a video all of its own coming soon, please subscribe, but this has been a basic history of the tactics used by fighter aircraft and how their doctrines have changed throughout history. Be sure to go check out Tog's channel, link will be down below. He does his own fantastic videos about jet fighters over there, and until next time, thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll catch you lads in the skies. Thank you to all our supporters on Patreon for making this video possible, with a special thanks to Mo, Ian Anderson, Universe, Dean Winger, Sukoshi Tiger, Captain Fubar, and Dragon of the West. If you like this video, I hope you subscribe and check out our other content, and if you really like what we do here, then consider supporting the channel on Patreon. And thanks for watching.
Switzerland's decision to procure the F-35 has sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The Lightning II beat out the Dassault Rafale, which is produced in France, the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is jointly produced by Germany, Italy, the UK, and Spain, and even the Boeing Super Hornet.